Okay, hi, so in this video we're going to speak about evolution and the different theories of evolution which have been suggested. Now, obviously Charles Darwin is the most famous one, but he wasn't the only person to suggest this kind of theory. There was another chap who looked something like this, and his name was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And he had a separate theory. Now, what Jean-Baptiste thought was that everything is linked by what he called the fountain of life. So the fountain of life. Now, this sounds a bit weird at the moment, but it's important to realise that this was in the 18th century. So this was 18th century, so that really means the late 1700s. So you're looking at around about 1780, which was a long time ago. Now, his suggestions included that everything came from an ancestor, which were primitive worms. So he suggested that we came from primitive worms. Now, as you can imagine, this was contested by a lot of people. We didn't really like the idea that we came from these worms, and so there was a lot of arguments. But what he said was that characteristics of an organism were controlled by their behaviour. So their behaviour. What this translates to really is that if you engage in a certain type of behaviour, your characteristics will change to allow you to carry out that behavioural thing or that type of behaviour more effectively. For example, if you see someone go to the gym a lot, they get bigger, they increase their muscle mass and they get stronger. What Lamarck said was that this means that their body has changed in order to allow them to carry out their functions more effectively. Where he was wrong is that he said that this would then be passed on to the offspring. However, if someone goes to the gym and obtains large muscle mass, or they go and they run a lot and then they become really fit, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be passed down to your offspring. In fact, training does not allow us to change our genetics in that way. And so, really, this has now been proved to be false most of the time. There are certain cases where actually this does happen. We can see in nature that sometimes behaviour actually changes your genes. Now, you don't go on to this into GCSE course because this is actually high-level genetics, but there are certain cases where he was, in a way, right. But it's important to note that these theories were brought about in the late 1700s. So, late 1700s. And the characteristics controlled by behaviour doesn't explain, or can't be explained by, as well, genetics. Okay, because your behaviour and your genetics are, most of the time, two separate things. But even though a lot of this is wrong, it was very important in affecting how another person actually thought about inheritance and how he thought about evolution of species. That was, of course, Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin is, of course, this bloke here. Charles Darwin. Now, his initial theories of evolution are the ones which do mostly hold strong today. And so let's have a closer look at his theories. There we go. And so how it started was in 1831, Darwin set out as the naturalist on the HMS Beagle. HMS Beagle, which of course was a boat. Now it's amazing to think at this time Darwin was only 22 years old. 22 years old. Now on the ship he was meant to be looking at geology. So set out to study geology. But what actually happened was that he observed a lot of different plants and animals, and he realised that these plants and animals were actually different depending on where they were located. Now, this was very interesting to him because you would see different types of the same animal. So types of animals would be slightly different depending on location. Different depending on their location. And these differences actually allowed them to carry out their different functions. For example, depending on where a type of tortoise was found, it would be adapted in order to survive the environment where it was found, and likewise for everything else. But the most famous example of the animals that Darwin studied were finches. So you'll often hear about Darwin's finches, and there are a large variety of these. And I forgot that I didn't write here that this was mainly on the Galapagos. The Galapagos, that's spelt with an A there, islands. Let's just rewrite that. Galapagos Islands. These islands varied in age, and each environment on the different islands was slightly different, and so it was very interesting to see a wide variety of different species on the different islands. Now, Darwin spent around 5 years on the Galapagos Islands studying all these different types of species, and he then returned home and he spent the next 20 years working on his ideas. So he built up the theory of evolution by natural selection. Okay, and that is a theory that still holds true today. A lot of people do believe it, some people don't. It's down to personal preference. It actually doesn't have to be mutually exclusive and different from believing in religion. And so a lot of people do now accept Darwin's theory. Okay, now just to quickly give you an idea of the different observations that Darwin made. This is it's a very simple diagram of the finches. And so we say, for example, all the finches started off like this. All of them ate seeds. Okay, so if they all ate seeds, then they had beaks which allowed them to crack the seeds open and obviously obtain their food. Now, what happened is as the finches moved to different islands, each of these represents a movement of the finches. They have adapted to eat different types of foods, because on some islands there wasn't many seeds, but there were loads of insects. And so in order to eat insects, they need these sharp beaks so that they can get inside the insects' burrows, and they can also obviously pick up the insects with their beaks and eat them. Okay, they don't need these huge beaks because that would stop them getting into small gaps where insects might be hiding. And so they've adapted, in this case, to have a beak which can help them eat the insects. Now, what about this one over here? Well, buds and fruit, they need different shaped beaks for those as well. And also it needs to be sharp because sometimes they need to pierce the outside of the fruit in order to get inside. So you can see here that the beak has actually changed. That is not because they have decided that they wanted their beak to change as a result of there being different amounts of food. This is actually a natural process which happens over a long time. That is natural selection, and that is what we're going to look at in the next video, okay? But I just wanted to give you a schematic which showed what we mean when we say that things have adapted or they have evolved to suit their environment. That means that they have actually turned into different species which have different characteristics, and therefore they are adapted to their environment. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I hope that helped. That was just a quick overview of the theories of evolution. Okay, there's obviously Darwin's theory, but you need to remember that before that, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came up with his theory, which of course actually allowed Darwin to move on from that thinking. So both are very important, but Darwin's is the one which is still accepted by a lot of people today. Okay, so if you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the comment box below or send me a direct email using the link. But I look forward to seeing you in the next video.